The Matilda is one of the most well-known tanks from the Second World War, and on this channel a year ago when I was just starting out, I made a video about this beautiful vehicle, but I wanted to remake a video about this infantry tank. The Matilda II is in my opinion in the top 3 best tanks Great Britain has ever made, only being behind the Challengers and of course the Centurion Universal Tank. Video for that is in the top right. Today we will uncover why I personally rate the Matilda II as one of the best tanks Great Britain has ever made, but also why I think that it is one of the best tanks from World War II. Now before we continue in this video, don't forget to leave a like, comment, as it helps the YouTube algorithm, and if you haven't done it already, don't forget to subscribe. The Matilda II tank was designed back in 1937 and very evidently so. The reason why I say that is because pre-World War II, France and Great Britain still thought that wars would be fought like World War I. And due to there not being any major armed conflicts where both sides used tanks, there was very little innovation in that department. They made these tanks which were very long and heavily armored, like for example the Charby 1 Bis or the Matilda II infantry tank. Next to the fact that the Matilda II was very well armored, they also had a solid gun, at least for that time. It was armed with the 2-pounder or 40mm main armament, which was more than sufficient to deal with any German tanks from the time in France or Italian tanks which they later would encounter in Egypt or Libya. I already mentioned how the armor of the Matilda was actually quite good for that time, but it came to a point that normal German tanks which were fielded at the time would have difficulties penetrating the Matilda with their 37mm or their shorter 75mm. So in order to deal with the Matilda IIs, they decided to actually get the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, which proved to be quite effective against the Matilda II and the Charby 1 Bis tanks. And after their campaign in France in 1940, they decided to upgrade the 37mm on the Panzer III tank to a 50mm L-42 to improve their anti-tank capabilities. But once they marched into the Soviet Union, this upgrade proved to be not enough. The Italians would also struggle quite a lot against the Matilda II tanks in North Africa. The British didn't really use a better main armament than the Italians did, but the main difference is that the Italians almost had no armor, and when they did it was riveted. Furthermore, the Italian tactics were absolutely horrible. The Italian tank doctrine wanted their tankers to fire while driving, which drastically decreases the accuracy of the rounds. If you want to learn more about Italian tank doctrine, you can do so by going to the video on the top right of your screen. One very interesting thing about the 2-pounder, however, is that the 2-pounder had -15 to +20 degrees in gun elevation. But the gun elevation wasn't mechanical or geared, the loader actually had to lift the 2-pounder by hand. But it did to make the main armament more stable while driving. Furthermore, the main armament only was using armor-piercing rounds. It did not have any high explosive rounds, and this is because the high explosive rounds on the 2-pounder were simply not effective at all. Furthermore, they did have a machine gun which would compensate somewhat for the lack of high explosive capabilities, and this machine gun would be the 7.92 Besa machine gun. We just talked about the fact that the Matilda II had a lot of armor, but let's look at the numbers. The Matilda II frontally had 78mm of armor on the glacis and turret, but let's compare this to the tanks from Germany, which they used during the invasion of France. They normally had about 13mm of frontal armor, but they realized this was not enough and they occasionally did add some armor plates to strengthen their fronts. Furthermore, normally when you talk about tanks, you have something called the all or nothing side, because the idea of course is for your tank to keep facing towards the front where your opponents or enemies are, and this is where you normally put all the armor. Famous examples of tanks like this are the Sherman Jumbo or tanks like the Panther, but there are rare exceptions to this rule. For example, the Soviet IS-2 tank, which was quite well armored all around, and another one was of course the Matilda II. The Matilda II was not only well armored at the front but also at the sides and rear. The sides are between 65mm to 70mm thick and the rear is around 55mm thick, which even for late war purposes was not a lot, but it still could take a hit. For example, normal Sherman medium tanks in late war versions of the Panzer IV would roughly have that amount of armor. Due to all this armor, the tank was quite heavy, so you need a good engine, and the engine which was eventually picked for the task was an AEC. but instead of only one engine it actually had two engines, which isn't very common. Furthermore, due to the amount of armor, the Matilda didn't have a very good top speed. It could only go around 21 km an hour on the road, and off-road it would be reduced to 14 km an hour. This may sound quite bad, and honestly, the top speeds are quite bad. But keep in mind it is an infantry tank. These tanks are not supposed to be fast. But the amount of armor definitely made up for the lack of speed. The Matilda II was just longer than 5.6 meters, just under 2.6 meters wide and just over 2.5 meters tall. This stature isn't out of the ordinary for tanks. It is not very tall, wide or long, but of course the smaller the more difficult it is to hit the vehicle. At least that is what it would be like back in the day. Nowadays, stature plays less of a factor due to the guided weapons, but it can still help you with concealment. In this tank there would normally fit about 4 crew members, the driver, the loader, the gunner and the commander, and this is the most common arrangement. With the loader, the gunner and the commander being positioned in the turret, while the driver would be in the front of the tank. Like we previously discussed, the Matilda has seen a lot of action throughout her career. For one is the Battle of France and one battle in particular, which was the Battle of Arras. The Matildas were sent there with the British Expeditionary Force, and some people say that due to the British attacking the Germans at the Battle of Arras, that they bought the forces trapped in the Dunkirk pocket enough time to escape. Of course, this is just speculation, but this kinda goes to show that the Matildas were actually useful. Eventually they did lose all of their tanks though. The Matilda II also fought in North Africa, which we already discussed earlier. They were notably effective against other tanks and tankettes from that time, like the L3-33 or the M1139, or tanks from the Afrika Korps, which in 1940 still used Panzer IIs, 3s and 4s. The only real threat to the Matilda IIs in late 1940, early 1941 were the 88mm and 105mm anti-aircraft guns. The Matilda IIs were slowly getting overtaken by more modern tanks and vehicles. This is because the Panzer III and the Panzer IV got better main armaments, like for example the 15mm L42, about which we already previously talked, and they also got more armor. So they started to look if they maybe could place a bigger main armament into the Matilda. One of the candidates for such an upgrade would be the 6-pounder main armament, which would be a very big upgrade over the 2-pounder. However, this did require a complete major overhaul of the hull due to the turret ring being relatively small. They did attempt this with a prototype, but this concept was eventually dropped and instead they decided to use the Valentine. Some of the phased out Matildas were sent off to places like a town in Somaliland, and others were lent-leased to the Soviet Union, which actually did succeed in putting in a better main armament. They were able to put the 76mm ZES-5, however, with the turret already being quite cramped to begin with, one can imagine how cramped it must be with the ZES-5 fitted in one of the Matildas. According to one of my sources, the Soviet Union actually did like the Matilda, being one of the most well-armored tanks on the Eastern Front, but the only thing they did struggle with was that the tracks were ill-suited for these icy conditions. Over the course of the war, the British sent some 1,000 Matildas to the Soviet Union in the hopes of helping their war effort, and lastly, in World War II the Matildas were also sent to the Australians, in an attempt to liberate or reconquer Asia from Japan. The Matilda was actually a very good tank for this due to the lack of anti-tank weapons from the Japanese. The best tank the Japanese actually also had was the Type 3 Chinu, and those were only available in late 1944. Those were also actually just stationed on the island of Kyushu, so they never actually even saw service. Furthermore, the Australians actually also did modify the Matildas by giving them flamethrowers, and I thought they actually also added a phone to the crew which was in the Matildas. Overall, the Matilda was one of the only tanks which actually fought in every single theater of World War II, which on its own is quite impressive, something even the Sherman tank hasn't achieved. Furthermore, the silhouette of the Matilda was also quite unmistakable in Africa, and it eventually was dubbed the Queen of the Desert by its crew. Overall, the Matilda was a very successful tank. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe as we're aiming for the 3,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Other than that, please do enjoy another video on the left or a playlist on the right. I'd like to thank VW German Luca for being a member of my channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.